Vladimir Komarov-Soyuz 1 on April 22, 1967. Vladimir Komarov walked through the corridors of the Baikonur Cosmodrome knowing he was likely heading toward his death. The 40-year-old Soviet cosmonaut had been selected to command Soyuz 1, the first crewed flight of the Soviet Union's new spacecraft, an urgently rushed project meant to beat America's Apollo program. Komarov knew what the public did not. His close friend and fellow cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had pleaded with Soviet leadership to delay the mission. Internal reports listed more than 200 serious design flaws discovered during testing. Among them were critical failures in the parachute system, unstable attitude control, unreliable ion sensors, and defects in the heat shield bonding. Engineers documented these dangers repeatedly, but political pressure from the Kremlin overruled safety concerns. The launch was scheduled to align with Lenin's birthday and the May Day celebrations, a propaganda victory the Communist Party desperately wanted. Komarov understood the impossible position he was in. If he refused to fly, his backup pilot would take his place, Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space and a national hero. Komarov could not allow his friend to die in a spacecraft he knew was unsafe. At 3:35 a.m. Moscow time on April 23, 1967, Soyuz 1 lifted off into the pre-dawn sky. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong. One of the spacecraft's 2 solar panels failed to deploy, cutting power generation in half and preventing proper orientation toward the sun. The batteries began draining rapidly. Faulty ion sensors caused the spacecraft to tumble uncontrollably, making automated stabilization impossible. Komarov fought to keep Soyuz 1 under control, manually firing attitude thrusters and burning through precious fuel. Ground control watched in growing alarm. The planned launch of Soyuz 2, which was supposed to rendezvous with Soyuz 1, was cancelled. After 80 increasingly desperate orbits, Mission Control ordered Komarov to attempt an emergency On April 24th, Soyuz 1 began its descent. Komarov manually oriented the spacecraft, trusting systems that had already failed him. The initial re-entry went as planned. The heat shield performed correctly as the capsule tore through the upper atmosphere. But at approximately 23,000 feet, the final failure occurred. The main parachute failed to deploy, trapped inside its container by a design flaw engineers had warned about months earlier. With virtually no drag, the spacecraft continued falling at extreme speed. Komarov deployed the backup parachute, but it immediately tangled with the partially deployed main chute and drogue, forming a useless mass of twisted fabric. There was nothing left to do. Soviet listening stations recorded Komarov's final transmissions as he fell toward Earth at over 250 miles per hour. He cursed the engineers and officials who had forced the mission forward, knowing he had less than a minute to live. At 7:24 a.m., Soyuz 1 slammed into the ground near Orenburg, creating a crater and igniting its remaining fuel. The impact was so violent that the descent module was crushed into a flattened disk less than a meter high. Komarov's body was burned beyond recognition, fused to the wreckage. Recovery teams spent hours separating his remains from the twisted metal. His death forced a reckoning. The Soviet space program grounded crewed flights for 80 months, redesigning the parachute system and correcting hundreds of flaws that political pressure had pushed aside. Vladimir Komarov became the first human to die during a man who knowingly sacrificed his life to save another and paid the ultimate price for a system that valued propaganda over safety. Soyuz 11. The lost crew of Salyut 1 on June 6, 1971, Soviet cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Bodukov, and Viktor Patsiev launched aboard Soyuz 11 from the Baikonur. Their mission was to dock with Salyut 1, the world's first operational space station, and demonstrate that humans could live and work in orbit for extended periods. Dobrovolsky served as commander, Volkov as flight engineer, and Patsiev as research engineer. All 3 were experienced and well-trained. The launch went flawlessly, and about 24 hours later, Soyuz 11 successfully docked with Salyut 1, making the crew the first humans in history to occupy a space station. For the next 22 days, the cosmonauts carried out an ambitious schedule of experiments. They conducted astronomical observations, biological and medical research, materials processing, and extensive Earth photography. They set new endurance records and proved that long-term space habitation was possible. Communications with ground control were consistently positive, and the crew even requested additional experiments to fill their remaining time aboard the station. On June 29th, after completing a highly successful mission, the crew sealed the hatches between Salyut 1 and Soyuz 11 and prepared for their return to Earth. Undock occurred normally at 9:28 p.m. Moscow time, and about 40 minutes later the spacecraft's engine fired for the deorbit burn, placing Soyuz 11 on its descent trajectory toward Kazakhstan. Re-entry initially appeared textbook perfect. The service and orbital modules separated cleanly from the descent module. The heat shield functioned as designed. The drogue parachute deployed, followed by the main parachute, which slowed the capsule to a safe descent rate. The soft landing rockets fired just before touchdown at 2:17 a.m. On June 30th, Soyuz 11 landed gently on the Kazakh steppe. Recovery helicopters were already overhead. Ground crews hurried to the capsule, expecting to greet 3 national heroes. Instead, when the hatch was opened, they found all 3 cosmonauts dead, still strapped into their seats. Their skin had turned blue. There were no signs of fire, collision, or mechanical destruction. Medical examination revealed the horrifying cause. During descent, a pressure equalization valve had opened prematurely, venting the cabin atmosphere directly into space. The valve was designed to open only near the ground, but it malfunctioned at an altitude of about 550,000 feet, well above the Kármán line. The cabin lost pressure in just 112 seconds. Unprotected and wearing no pressure suits, the crew likely lost consciousness within 15 to 20 seconds and died from hypoxia within a minute. The investigation later concluded that the valve had been damaged during module separation, likely struck or loosened by debris or explosive bolts used to jettison the spacecraft's sections. The loss of Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev remains the only human fatalities to occur in space itself, above the atmosphere. Their deaths forced sweeping changes in Soviet spacecraft design. Pressure systems were reinforced, and most importantly, cosmonauts were required to wear pressure suits during launch and re-entry, a safety rule that remains standard in human spaceflight today. Soyuz 11 proved that humans could live in space, but it also revealed, at the highest possible cost, how unforgiving it truly is. The Challenger disaster, STS-51L, on the morning of January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger sat on Launch Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center, prepared for its 10th mission. The 7-member crew consisted of Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNear, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire selected for NASA's Teacher in Space program. The mission had already been delayed several times due to technical issues and poor weather, creating growing pressure from NASA management, the media, and the public to launch. The night before liftoff, engineers at Morton Theo, the contractor responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters SRBs, raised serious concerns. Senior engineers Roger Boisgeli and Alan McDonald urgently recommended postponing the launch. They warned that the extreme cold could cause the O-rings to stiffen, preventing them from sealing properly and allowing superheated gases to escape during ignition. A tense late-night teleconference followed, lasting several hours. NASA officials pushed back, arguing there was no definitive proof the cold would cause a failure. Under intense pressure to avoid another delay, Morton Thiokol management overruled their own engineers and gave approval to proceed. At 11:38 a.m. EST, Challenger lifted off in front of hundreds of spectators, including Krista McAuliffe's family and students. For the first minute, the launch appeared normal. The shuttle accelerated rapidly, climbing toward orbit. At 59 seconds after lift, high-speed cameras recorded a small flame emerging from the lower joint of the right solid rocket booster. The cold, stiffened O-rings had failed exactly as predicted. Superheated gas over 50 degrees Fahrenheit escaped and burned like a blowtorch against the external fuel tank. The flame weakened the strut, connecting the booster to the tank. At 72 seconds into flight, traveling at Mach 1.92, at an altitude of about 48,000 feet, the external tank ruptured. Liquid hydrogen and oxygen exploded, engulfing the shuttle in a massive fireball. Contrary to popular belief, the explosion did not kill the crew instantly. The crew compartment remained largely intact and was violently thrown free, continuing upward briefly before falling toward the Atlantic Ocean in a ballistic arc. Emergency oxygen systems activated automatically, and evidence suggests that at least some crew members were conscious during the fall. Just before structural breakup, pilot Michael Smith was heard saying, "Oh," indicating the crew realized something had gone terribly wrong. The crew cabin fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds, reaching speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour before striking the ocean 18 miles offshore. The impact was uncertain. All 7 astronauts were killed instantly. In the aftermath, NASA suspended space shuttle flights for 32 months. A presidential investigation, the Rogers Commission, concluded that the disaster was caused not only by technical failure, but by organizational and managerial decisions that ignored engineering warnings. The solid rocket boosters were completely redesigned, including improved O-ring seals and the addition of joint heaters to prevent cold weather failure. The Challenger disaster remains one of the most tragic reminders in history of the consequences of prioritizing schedules and politics over safety. The Columbia disaster, STS-107, on January 16, 2003. Space Shuttle Columbia roared off the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, beginning a 16-day science mission known as STS-17. On board were 7 astronauts: Commander Rick Husbaugh, pilot William McCool, mission specialists Kalpana Shah, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Michael Anderson, along with payload specialist Elon Ramon. No space station visits, no flashy construction, just pure science. Columbia's mission was basically a flying laboratory inside a research module packed into the cargo bay. The crew planned to run more than 80 experiments, working around the clock in shifts. From the outside, it looked like a textbook launch, but the cameras caught something ugly almost immediately. Just 81.7 seconds after lift, while Columbia was ripping through the sky at roughly 1,568 miles per hour and climbing past 65,000 feet, a large chunk of foam insulation tore loose from the external fuel tank. It came from the bipod ramp area and slammed straight into the leading edge of the shuttle's left wing. This wasn't a tiny flake. The foam weighed about 1.67 pounds and measured roughly 21 by 27 inches, far bigger than the debris NASA was used to shrugging off. Engineers reviewed the launch footage, but foam strikes had happened before, and none had destroyed a shuttle. The working assumption was simple: we've seen this movie already, and it always ends fine. Some engineers weren't convinced. The debris assessment team, made up of NASA and Boeing engineers, pushed for high-resolution images of the wing using military satellites or ground-based telescopes. They wanted to know exactly what that foam had done. Management said no. The reasoning was brutally circular. Even if damage existed, Columbia couldn't dock with the ISS and wasn't equipped for serious repairs, so why look? The request was denied. The problem was quietly shelved. What no one outside engineering circles fully grasped was that the foam impact had punched a 6 to 10-inch hole in one of the reinforced carbon panels protecting the wing's leading edge, the part that takes the full blast of re-entry heat. Columbia was now flying with a fatal wound. For the next 16 days, the crew worked non-stop, completely unaware. Experiments ran smoothly. Mission updates were calm, professional, even upbeat. From orbit, everything looked perfect. Columbia did exactly what it was sent to do. On February 1, 2003, the shuttle fired its engines to begin the trip home as Columbia slammed back into the atmosphere at over 17,000 miles per hour. The initial phase of re-entry looked normal. Heat shields did their job, except where one no longer existed. Superheated plasma poured through the hole in the left wing, turning the interior into an oven. Temperatures inside the structure climbed past to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, melting aluminum and destroying the wing from the inside out. Sensors began reporting strange temperature spikes and system failures, but nothing that immediately screamed total loss. At 8:59 a.m. EST, while streaking over Texas at about 207,000 feet, the weakened left wing finally gave way. Once it separated, aerodynamics did the rest. Columbia became uncontrollable and disintegrated in seconds. Debris rained across Texas and Louisiana. The crew cabin did not survive the breakup. All 7 astronauts were killed instantly. The investigation that followed changed NASA permanently. Foam strikes were no longer treated as normal. Every mission would include detailed heat shield inspections. and shuttles were given on-orbit repair capabilities. The Columbia disaster exposed not just a technical failure, but a mindset one that confused familiarity with safety. In spaceflight, the fact that something hasn't killed you yet doesn't mean it never will. X-15 flight, 36,597 on November 15th. 1967. U.S. Air Force Major Michael J. Adams strapped himself into the cockpit of X March 15 at Edwards Air Force Base. He was 37 years old, on his 7th X-15 flight, and very much on NASA's radar as a future astronaut. This wasn't a rookie joyride. Adams was a proven test pilot, handpicked for flying machines that lived where airplanes stopped making sense. The X-15 wasn't really a plane and not quite a spacecraft either. It existed in that awkward gray zone between sky and space, pushing past 50 miles up, where air stops behaving and physics starts getting rude. Adams' mission flight, 36,597, was supposed to be straightforward by X-15 standards. Climb to 250,000 feet, test a new ultraviolet stellar photography experiment, and evaluate how the craft's reaction controls behaved in near-vacuum conditions. At 10:30 a.m., the X-15 was dropped from a modified B-52 at 45,000 feet over the Mojave Desert. Adams lit the XLR-99 rocket engine, unleashing 57,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft surged forward, blasting past 3,800 miles per hour as it clawed its way upward. Early reports were calm. Engine good. Handling normal? Everything looked textbook. The X-15 reached 266,000 feet, higher than planned. Officially, Adams had crossed into space, making him, tragically, the first human to die during a space somewhere during this high-altitude phase, though the flight quietly started coming apart. The aircraft developed a subtle yaw, a sideways rotation Adams didn't immediately detect. Up there, the air is so thin that the usual seat-of-the-pants feedback just doesn't exist. The reaction control system, meant to handle movement where wings are useless, wasn't doing its job. Adams was drifting into trouble without realizing how deep he was already in it. When the X-15 began descending, that gentle yaw turned ugly. The craft entered a spin. Adams tried to fight it using conventional flight controls, but at that altitude and speed, they might as well have been decorative. Ground controllers watched the radar track twist into something alarming and tried to help, but communication was spotty. The hypersonic plasma surrounding the aircraft didn't care about radio signals. Dropping through 200,000 feet, the X-15 finally hit thicker air normally the moment when control returns. Instead, the aircraft was now flying at an extreme angle of attack, essentially sideways, at over 3,000 miles per hour. The atmosphere didn't stabilize the plane. It tried to tear it apart. By 65,000 feet, screaming along at Mach 3.5, the forces became unbearable. Gilloads exceeded 15 gigaseconds, far beyond what both the aircraft and a human body could survive. The X-15 began to disintegrate midair, shedding pieces as the structure failed. Adams likely lost consciousness before the final breakup. The main wreckage slammed into the desert near Johannesburg, California, carving a crater into the ground. Adams was found still strapped into his ejection seat. It had never been activated. The investigation later concluded that a failure in the adaptive flight control system triggered the initial yaw error. Adams never truly had a chance to recover from the crash. Forced changes in high-altitude pilot training and highlighted the need for more robust backup control systems for vehicles operating on the edge of space. Michael J. Adams was posthumously awarded astronaut wings, not for landing safely, not for coming home, but for crossing into space and never making it back. Sometimes, history's pioneers don't get remembered for what they discovered, only for how far they fell trying to get there.